everybody. First, I want to welcome everybody to my lecture. It's called Live to Tell. And essentially what my lecture is going to try to get at the heart of is, how do you take somebody's real, true life narrative, somebody's true story, and turn that into a script or a play? How do you go about doing that? It's probably one of the trickiest things that a playwright or a writer or a scriptwriter can do. And it doesn't come without its bit of controversy. There are many within the writing community that may find this activity to be exploitative or not a good thing. Oftentimes, a lot of controversy will come because oftentimes when you're telling the story of a person, the reason that you're telling that story is because there is some interest attached to it. It's a famous person or a person that has done something notable or a person who has experienced something notable. So what you're going to always have is a narrative that lives in the mind of the reader or the viewer that you always have to contend with. So one of the first things you're going to have to do is you're just going to have to flat out make a choice. No matter what the story is, what the person is, you're going to have to make a decision in your own head. What do you feel about this story? And what is it about this person's story that draws you specifically to it? Once you have made that choice, once you have made that decision, then you can move forward in deciding what you want to do. So I'm going to take a couple of different scenarios of telling somebody's true life story and move forward in how you tackle each individual situation, because there are a bunch of different situations that deal with reinterpreting somebody's story. So the first one I'll tackle is probably the easiest, which is historical stories of people who lived years ago, and you're going to tell that story and interpret that for an audience. Oftentimes that's easier because one, the person isn't alive to really argue, and second, oftentimes the family members aren't alive or aren't around, the immediate family members, to battle you over it. And oftentimes when you're dealing with a famous person, you don't have to contend with this idea that the person's story is a personal one. You know, when you're George Washington, for instance, at a certain point, if you are dead long enough and famous long enough, your story becomes a narrative for everybody, and everybody can have some ownership in it. So you do have some feeling that you can put into it and some bit of interpretation, and you have some leeway in how you interpret that character. You don't want to bastardize it. You don't want to do dishonor to the narrative, but you do have some freedom in how you interpret it, especially if you're dealing with a character that lives pre-television. There is no video of the person. At a certain point, there are certain narrative holes in their stories that the writer has to fill. You know, in some ways, you have to kind of make it up in a certain way. You have to kind of put yourself in that person's point of view. And I do a lot of that kind of writing, where I may be doing a story of Garrett Morgan, the first person to invent the gas mask. And I have to sort of fill in the holes of his story and figure out what it would have been for that person to live a certain life and go through the world. When you're dealing with that kind of situation, or you're telling the story of Terence, the first African American playwright who lived in Rome, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, what you can do with something like that is just go heavy research. So whenever I'm doing a historical person and I'm telling their story or interpreting for screen, or I'm doing the story of Ellen Craft, who was a slave who escaped from the South by dressing as a male and having her husband accompany her as her slave. There are no written declarations really of what happened there. There aren't really a lot of newspaper clippings about it that's going to give you any guidance. So what I usually do in those situations, I gather the best and widest array of research that I can find, and I sit it on a table and I spend several days. It may be a week or two, and all I do is just read histories and stories and try to find the person in the midst of all of that, using my own humanity, quite frankly, as a guide. of what it would have been like to live in those times. So when you're doing these historical narratives, all you're doing is going through all of this, trying to find a nugget that speaks to you. And what I am looking for oftentimes is the sort of nugget, the sort of secret that unlocks that person's story. So when I was doing sort of the story of William Box Brown, who was Henry Box Brown, a guy who mailed himself out of slavery. He put himself in a box and nailed himself in and then mailed himself to Philadelphia. And I'm doing all of this research because there's nothing that talks about really who the man is or, how he was as a person. And I have to write all of this dialogue about him. And so I just kept searching through the history and trying to find that nugget that jumped out and said, hey, Oatman, this is the story. This is the real story. And I'm searching and I'm searching and I'm searching and I'm searching. And finally, I find a nugget in there that talks about the fact that when he mailed himself out of slavery, he left his family behind. And not only did he leave his family behind, he became sort of fairly successful entertainer and he toured around doing a lot of things, but he never went back for his family. And I said, that's interesting. That creates sort of this idea of this guy who was living with this duality where he had gained the world by getting his freedom, but then he had lost his wife and children and never went back. And to me, that was sort of the core of trying to create this character. And I used that as the center of the story, this guy who had gained the world but lost the world at the exact same time. And that gave me something to kind of hang the narrative onto, something to give me a sense of who the man was and how he thought and sort of the complexity of the man. Instead of playing him as sort of a flat hero, this gave me a very complex person with very complex emotions and ideas. And so when I'm doing historical narratives, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to find that nugget that I can kind of hang my hat on, that piece of the story that I want to tell. Oftentimes when you're dealing with a historical narrative and you have all of this research, it's very difficult to tell the whole story. You can't tell it all. So you have to find that little piece of it that you want to essentially magnify and make your narrative and your story. I did the story of the first black Texas Ranger, a guy named Bass Reeves. And there was exhaustive information about him, even though there wasn't a lot of personal information. There was a lot of information about all of his exploits and these different criminals that he caught and all of the rough and tumble things that he went through. And I even saw a play that was based on his life, and it was very much a play that dealt with the myth of Bass Reeves. It was like a tough man, a quiet guy who walked around with a gun and was shooting people. In the play was a lot of shootouts. They did a play in North Carolina. I went to the International Black Theater Festival in North Carolina, and it was all about the myth of the man. And for me, that's usually an avenue I don't do, because oftentimes when you're dealing with a person, you can deal with the person or you can deal with the myth, the mythos of the person. I tend to try to go towards the person. Not that playing the myth isn't okay too. But to me, playing the myth sometimes is a little too shallow for me. Like it's the difference between, they did a story about Wyatt Earp, and one of them was Tombstone, where it was sort of like this mythical shoot 'em up, and then they did one that was more about the guy, the travails that he went through, the failures that he had in his life. It was a more humanistic approach done by Kevin Costner. I tend to go the Kevin Costner route. I want to find the human person in the narrative. So when I was doing this Bass Reeves piece, I was looking for the human in Bass Reeves, not this sort of cartoon dime store novel side of him. And in there, I found an account that talked about how he had a son who was much softer than him. It's sort of that typical second generation thing that happens where the father or the mother or the parent is this tough person or really strong in some area, and then they have a child that is just far easier and less focused, not as tough than the generation that came before. And so he had a son who was not a really strong character. And Bass Reeves was known to be really hard on his son, spoke really hard to him, and there are accounts of him speaking really roughly with him, being lazy and slothful and things like that, and public. And so there was a account that extended from that talked about how this soft son, his wife cheated on him and had a public affair with him, and he assaulted her to the point where she passed. You know, he went in and assaulted her because in the account it said that he went to talk to his father about it, and the father asked, did he beat her? You know, what did he do to you know, discipline her? And he said nothing. And then after saying nothing, he got his father's disapproval and then killed the wife and tried to discipline her for having an affair. And in the story, they talk about how Bass Reeves was actually the person who brought him back into the fold, basically arrested him and brought him back in. So when I heard that, I said, wow, that is my story laid bare in front of me. The story of this really tough father who was hard on this ne'er-do-well son. The son comes to him and he gives him really bad advice and then ends up killing his wife. And now the father has to go and catch this son who did this awful thing, in some ways, because of bad guidance. And that was the storyline that I created. And that's a lot of me stitching stuff out of whole cloth and inferring a lot. And that became the kernel of the story, because once I heard that, everything else started to fall in place. It's sort of like you're searching, and then once you put your hand on it, it's like everything starts clearing up and everything starts to really play out in your mind. And so that's what that was for me. And so when I wrote the play, once I had that chunk of story, everything else fell into place. Now, in the case of a Bass Reeves or a Henry Box Brown, these are fairly unknown people that we don't know. And so there's a little leeway there. Now, when it comes to more famous people whose story that you're telling, that can be a lot tricky, a lot more of a tricky proposition, because what you oftentimes end up with is, and I said this earlier when I started, is you have a view of this person, but people have a view of that person that is not only different from what you may think, but it's personal. And your account of that person may actually be an affront to them. The idea that you would have this view of them is anathema to them. I mean, and that can really be tough. And that is an area in which I have definitely gotten in trouble as both a writer and as a director. But certainly as a writer, I've gotten into trouble because of that. I did an account of Tupac Shakur, who was a person who really lived. People really cared about him in my community. And I tried to capture a more quiet, private Tupac. And so, again, we go into this area of, do I tell the story of the man or do I tell the story of the myth? And I wanted to find the man, but the audiences who have been raised on his movie, especially in my community, and I grew up in East Cleveland, which is sort of an inner city, tough, gritty, urban community. Well, when we put the play up, because it was about Tupac, the audience drew a lot of people from that community, and they came there very much wanting to see that mythos play out of this tough, swaggering, take no prisoners Tupac. But as I did my research and listened to interviews of people who actually knew him, I realized that there was much more of a personal Tupac, who was far different from his public persona. a very sensitive soul, a very insecure soul, a soul that was always searching for a father figure that he never had. And so my goal was to capture that Tupac. And a lot of people weren't happy about that. They felt it was too soft, or it was too this, or it was too that, or that I was watering down his legacy. Because oftentimes you got to realize that when somebody comes to see a famous person that you're telling their story on stage, they know the mythos. They haven't sat there and done 30 hours of research like you have. They haven't watched all the videos that you have. Oftentimes, you may have a firmer grasp on who that person really was behind the scenes than does the audience that comes to see them. So when they walk in and they see this thing revealed to them on stage, it is very much a discovery for them. They don't have a clue at what they're looking at. And oftentimes, by looking at it, it will enrage them. It will feel very much like a betrayal of who that character was. And then you add in sort of societal overtones into that. And then you really can get into trouble. You know, I was dealing with a black man, and there are many in my community that believe that black men are in some way lessened or weakened when they're put into popular entertainment and culture. So you're dealing with all of these different threads that you're trying to navigate, and all you can really be is be true to yourself as the writer and stand behind it, you know. And so when we did the talkbacks, I got a pretty hard dose of reality of what people thought of this portrayal of Tupac, but I stood behind it. And there were people who really loved it and really liked it, you know. And then there were some people who even saw it and initially were shocked by it, but it kind of grew on them when they thought about his life. And as time has passed and we've learned more about Tupac, we've learned that he was less of a thug than what we thought he was. Now that the years have passed and some of the mythos machines that exist in the music industry that push this narrative, now a lot of those machines don't have financial interest in creating that mythos. Now we're getting a real view of who the guy really was. That, you know, what's the saying? He didn't have a record until he got a record deal. You know, that's the Tupac that I wanted to capture. And today I'm very proud of, you know, being one of the first entities that we told that story. And sometimes when you're doing this kind of work, you got to be the canary in the coal mine. You have to be willing to go out there and create a person that on stage for people that people may not even recognize, even though they are attached to a famous name. So that's one of the first things I wanted to tackle. And the reason I always tackle this first is because oftentimes when you want to be a successful or viable playwright, some of the best work that you'll get sometimes is the recreation of people long dead, historical figures, popular figures. This will be some of the best money oftentimes you make. So when you go out into the world and start doing this kind of work, this might be one of the first kind of plays that sort of introduces itself to you. And so I want you to be ready to deal with some of the pitfalls that come with it. And again, I want to hit some of the major points. Find the kernel of the story that interests you. Research. And I also want to put in here that I want you to be really careful when you're doing the historical stuff or the stuff of people who lived, even say back in the 80s. I want you to be really careful about what we call given circumstances. And I'm sure for anybody who's a playwright or who has worked in the field of script writing, you've heard the term given circumstances. And all given circumstances are some of the sort of regional flavor of what the piece is about, where it's set, what's the time period, what are these things. And you want to make sure you get some mastery of that. What is the region it's set in? What is the location that it's set in? What is the time period in which it's setting? What are some of the sort of societal movements that are happening at this time? Because you want to capture a little bit of that. So if I do a play about people living in the early 1980s in the Reagan era, there's a certain feel to that era that I want to bring into the piece to give it a certain level of authenticity. Because when you're dealing with all the historical stuff, you're always going to get the hair splitters that want to make sure they come in and tell you when you get stuff wrong. So you want to get some of that easier sort of low-hanging fruit stuff. You want to get that right. If it's set in Boston and you're dealing with, say, JFK, you want to get that Boston accent right. You want to get some of that dialect right. You want to get certain tropes that might be popular within that region or within that time frame. You want to get some of those things and sprinkle them through. Now, for me in my process, that happens after I write the narrative. I write my first draft. I get sort of the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then once I get the beginning, middle, and end, I treat it almost like a sculptor treats a lump of clay. Once I've slammed that lump of clay onto the table, now I can start shaping. I always say, my saying is always that the writing of a piece or a play does not really begin until after the first draft is completed. That's where the real writing starts. So once I've gotten that lump of clay, I go back to my given circumstances. And what I usually do is start layering in those little pieces and little touches that play to the given circumstances. What is the regionality? What is some of the slang that I need to get right? How do I adjust this dialogue? How do I adjust this movement? How do I affect these characters using the given circumstances to do that? Now, for me, the story is always important first. I get the story right first. And once I have that beginning, middle, end, then I go back for the quicker touches. Now, other people may do it differently. They may need to write the given circumstances stuff as they go. And that's fine too. There's nothing wrong with that. But for me, I like to do it afterwards because I want to focus on it. I do a rewrite, and I'll do one specific rewrite that is nothing but dialogue. And not only dialogue, but dialogue, how it fits within a certain regionality when I'm dealing with this kind of writing. When I'm dealing with this kind of writing. But that is the historical live to tell experience. Now I want to talk a little bit about, and this one will be a little trickier, but I want to talk about living people, particularly those who have experienced some tragedy or are dealing with some challenge, and you have to tell that story. That's a totally different beast, but I want to dip into that for just a moment. Okay, so another kind of writing that I do in terms of live to tell is when you're telling a true life experience about somebody who is not dead, somebody that is not a historical figure, somebody that is alive, and somebody who is with us now. And you're oftentimes going in to tell the story of either a tragedy that's happened in their life, or it may be some sort of challenge that they're trying to overcome. I like to view this as the modern day equivalent of the problem play. These are extremely tricky to write, and these are the ones that'll probably get you in trouble the most. These are the most where these are going to be the stories where you're most in danger of legal repercussions, because I've done a few of these and had sort of legality sort of thrown at me. And what these plays are, and I'll give you, for instance, I did a play about the death of Tamir Rice. Really touchy stuff. And this was only, a few years after Tamir Rice had been murdered. And I live in the city in which his mother lives. So, you're writing a story about a situation in which you may bump into that young man's mother at the grocery store. Those are tough situations, and you're writing under a special kind of pressure when you're dealing with those kind of stories. Now, when I talked earlier about how some people believe that this kind of writing can be exploitative, this is where you'll be open to that charge. So you're sort of edged between two kind of hard places. You're edged between the family and getting it right and telling the story so that, they don't become offended. And then you're on this other end, people within your own community who feel that in some ways this is not a legitimate form of playwriting, sort of this catharsis of a crime or some painful event, that it is in some way exploiting that event. So I'll speak to both of those. In dealing with the family, you want to be sensitive to what's going on, but you also want to be sensitive to the truth. And you want to try to tell as much of this truth as you can and also get other perspectives. That can be difficult. So when we did Tamir Rice, we didn't just talk to his mother. We talked to his teachers. We talked to his social workers. We talked to people that knew them, people that knew the family. And not all those opinions may not have been what the family wanted you to use. But you have to get sort of as rounded a view as you could, especially about something that was a national tragedy like Tamir Rice. So when you do a piece about Tamir Rice a couple years after his death, they're going to come see that. That is going to make the paper. There are going to be eyeballs on that try to really focus on what you're doing. And so what we tried to do to kind of avoid too much controversy is, instead of doing sort of a specific thing towards that young man, we wanted to do something that dealt with the community response to it. And by framing it as a response to the Tamir Rice shooting, it allowed us to have more range of views and opinions that we can put in the piece, and just how various people were responding to it. And in this piece, what we decided to go with, and it's something that sometimes is preferable. A preferable tool is to go and use an evidence-based model. And what evidence-based means, I'm sure you know already. Evidence-based is just when you go and you, instead of just writing a bunch of fictional stuff of what you think the story is, you go and you almost become sort of a theatrical reporter. And you go and you actually interview people. You pull out a tape recorder, you sit it down, you interview people, and you do sometimes these long, exhaustive interviews. And then once you're done with those interviews, you take the interview and then you cut it down into a chunk or two, and you create a narrative that you go and you put into a theatrical setting. And sometimes this works best because instead of adding too much of your own opinion or perspective, you're literally doing a play that is about discovery. You're talking to people and finding out opinions. And oftentimes what happens is you get surprised. People say things you never expected them to say. People have perspectives that you never thought they would have when you're talking to them. And so then you take that and you cut it down, and you take that sort of narrative and you have it performed and directed and interpreted on stage. And that's one sort of tool you can use in Live to Tell. Now, in this kind of trope, you want to make sure that the interview is really good and really tight. So a lot of times when you do this, you have to have multiple skills. You can't just be a writer, but you got to have some of the same skills that a reporter would have. So one of the things you want to make sure when you're doing an evidence-based piece is you want to make sure to have a pad with you, a pen and pad, as well as a tape recorder. And you might be saying, well, if I have a tape recorder and I'm recording it, why do I need a pen and pad to write with? Well, you want that because the main thing you want to do when people are talking is you want to listen. You want to be listening, and when they get on a roll, you don't want to stop them. So when they're talking about something, you want to kind of, I use the term finding a vein. Like when you're digging for gold or digging for some mineral, you want to find this big vein of gold, and boom, you dig in, and then wow, all this gold is there. Well, you want to do the same thing in an interview. You want to be searching for these really strong emotions, and once they happen, you don't want to have to interrupt them. That's where the pad and pen comes in. So when you're digging and you're asking these questions, boom, you hit a vein. Now, at the beginning of this vein, they may say something that you want to counter. And so your instinct is, wait a minute, well, what does that mean? But then you're stopping that flow and stifling them from having the moment. And what you want to do, instead of doing that, you want to take that pad and pen, write down your question. And then you may have 3 or 4 questions, or 5 or 10. But as they're talking, write down a question that you have of something where you want more clarity on, or you want to know more about. But don't stop that flow. Once they get going, let them talk. Let them tell their story, and don't get in the way of it. And that's what all good reporters know. And when you're doing evidence-based work, that's something that you have to do as well. And so what you do is, after they've kind of exhausted that vein and kind of, boom, let loose all of that, emotional energy that has been pent up with them for so long, and then they're done with that, then you pick up your pad and pen, and now you can go back and start going through those questions. You said blah, blah, blah. Can you give me more clarity on that? What does that mean? Or do a much stronger follow-up than the one I just gave you there. But you can go through your follow-up questions, and then you can get more clarity on stuff that you may want to use in the piece. But it allows them to talk, because you never, never, never want to be cutting them off. It has to be their story. And so then you're going to do as exhaustive a interview as you can. Make sure to have your interview questions before you walk in. I know some people's interviewing style is to have more of a conversation, and it's just a back and forth, and it's almost in the moment. I believe that evidence-based pieces, because the emotional stakes are usually so high, you're coming in, you're doing a piece on a woman. Like there was one piece here in town called Live Bodies for Sale, and it was about women who had been sexually trafficked. Well, when you have that much emotional stake on the line, you can't free will that. And you can't take that off the top of your head. You have to have questions that have been researched, that have been thoroughly considered. And I would always say, or at least this is my process, I always bring in other people that I can, before I go in and interview the subject, that I can fire these questions to back and forth, so I can have sort of a conversation of how that should work, how it should go. Does this seem offensive? I sort of test them back and forth. And then once I've sort of shot them back and forth with other minds that I trust, I then go back and then write down a set of really intelligent, targeted questions to sort of get their story to come out in a natural way. And sometimes it can be tough, because you're talking about tough stuff. And it can feel really difficult when you're asking people difficult questions about the death of a child, or being sexually trafficked, or one young lady, I helped bring her piece to the stage, and it was all about her dealing with drug addiction and then becoming a sex worker and all of the terror of that. And you have to dig into that with that person. You got to have a certain steadiness of your emotional state, because that stuff can be tough. And so if you're going to ask some of those questions, you got to really know what you're asking and be really solid, because oftentimes those things can get really emotional. Now, I talked before about how some feel that this is not a proper way to do playwriting, and I respect everybody's opinion, and if people aren't into it, I get it. and my response to those people when they say, it's exploitative, and it's this and it's that, and you shouldn't be asking people about these kind of things, and evidence-based plays are a fad, and they're awful, and da-da-da-da. Again, all I can offer you is my lived experience. And that's all I have to offer you. And I can just tell you, from the ones that I've witnessed, for instance, I went to go see I think I mentioned this before, Live Bodies for Sale. And it wasn't my play. I had nothing to do with it other than I went to go see the show. And I knew the playwright, a guy named Christopher Johnson, really strong playwright, who's also he writes novels about true life subjects. He does a lot of sort of creative nonfiction stuff. And he did this play. And I went on the night. I just happened to come on the night where the actual women who were representing on stage were in the audience to see the play. And for people who say, you shouldn't do it, or you're being exploitative, all I can tell you is how the ladies responded to seeing their story. And what I heard time and time and time again from the ladies who were in that audience was, for the first time, they felt their story was being told. And that was important to them, and it meant something to them. I don't know if it's proper or not proper, or how you feel about that, but for those ladies, it was really important to have their stories told, and told in a way that they felt really conveyed the pain of the situation. Oftentimes they were saying when they go and do these newspaper stories, they don't feel like they're the center of it. Like oftentimes they would say the trafficker is the center of the story and not the victims themselves. And for the first time, they felt that they were humanized in a way that meant something to them. And it's the same thing with Tamir Rice. When we did Tamir Rice, his mother, she was, fairly moved by that experience of what these actors did to sort of tell the story of how her son's death impacted not just her family, but an entire community of people. And she felt that story was being told. And so when people come back and say, it's awful, da, 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 I said, I don't know what to tell you, man. I looked into the eyes of the mother, and I can just tell you what it meant to her. And so if playwriting can be a vehicle to tell people's stories, I feel like that's what we should be doing. If it can be a vehicle for people to even begin to heal in some way, or to take that experience and go do other things with it. Because once Live Bodies for Sale went up, for instance, they did a bunch of talkbacks in which they shared resources for people who might be in that same situation. They shared information, things to do to recognize a predator when they come. And that was all because of that play. It sort of created this this sort of platform in which we can now talk about this issue more and talk about the dangers of it. And that doesn't make it perfect, but I think it certainly makes it worthwhile that it is this thing that can do some social good. And that's why I said previously that, in my mind at least, this is like the modern day problem play. Because that's really what problem plays were back in the day. They were sort of these instruments of social good. They were these plays that, yes, they were there to entertain, but they were also there to change your mind. They were also there to change how you conducted yourself. They were there to give a platform to these serious issues and maybe actually matter. The sort of evidence-based play, I think, has some of the same power of that. There's a certain, and I don't want to be corny, but there is a certain power to people telling their story in a fairly unobstructed way. And so for me, that gets back to sort of more of the practical side of this. What are some of the rules of the road when you're doing one of these evidence-based plays? For me, I use a gentleman by the name of Studs Terkel, who was a newspaper guy, kind of one of these characters that if he didn't exist, you'd have to invent him. Sort of an old guy, chomping down on a stogie. And he used to do these books. And these books would essentially be a collection of evidence-based essays, these long narratives, almost like a slave narrative. He would go interview people for days and days and days, and then cut and shape that narrative into sort of a first-person monologue is how they essentially read. And I use sort of his rules of the road as a guide, and also use as a guide sort of the work of Anna Deavere Smith, who will basically take a social problem. One of her famous plays is Twilight, which dealt with the riots in L.A. in the 90s, and she basically went in there, interviewed a bunch of people, took those interviews and cut them into monologues, and then performed them. And a couple things that they have come up with, both of them, certain rules that I try to follow. One of the rules is when I'm doing one of these interviews, as much as I am tempted to do so, and I am definitely tempted to do this in terms of an artist, is to add things. I don't add anything. I don't add a word, I don't add a syllable, I don't add a period. Even if it makes this little piece flow better, I don't add anything to their story. So that's number one. Don't add anything. 2, cutting is okay. Although I won't add anything, I will do my bit of cutting and snipping at the ends. So cutting and editing is okay. And not only is it okay for this kind of creation, it's imperative and necessary. You have to edit. So you might have to cut it down. So you may have something that will take up, 10 pages. You got to cut that down to a page or 2. And so you got to figure out what to cut. Number 3, grouping is okay. Grouping is okay. And what I mean by that is this. You may be doing an interview with somebody and they're talking and they start talking about when they're a child and they went down by the lake and that whole experience. And then, like most humans, they oftentimes will segue into something else that has nothing to do with that. So they're talking about boats and being by the lake, and then next thing you know, they're talking about a fire truck that they used to see drive past their house, and they're talking about there. And then back at the bottom, they start talking about being down by the lake again. And then It's okay to cut both of those pieces and then put them together as though they're one thing. As long as it doesn't change the meaning, doesn't change what's happening, especially if you're cutting out something that gets to the heart of why you're interviewing them. So I was interviewing one woman on the street. She was a sex worker. I wanted to talk to her about her response to Tamir Rice, and at the beginning of it, she started talking about her daughter and her daughter's experience. Then she starts talking about Tamir Rice, and then she gets at the end of it, she gets into this long monologue about how her daughter went through stuff, and then I realized that her daughter didn't just go through stuff. She reveals later that her daughter actually got murdered by police, according to her. They got shot up. She got shot up a bunch of times. And then I realized I was talking to the mother of a very famous case that happened here in Cleveland. And it was sort of by accident. I just happened to stumble into her on the sort of hard Scrabble streets. And so what I did is she says, hey, she really wanted her daughter's story taken because she felt like her daughter was in some way vilified by the media and by the police. And so I cut out those pieces that just dealt with her daughter. And then I kind of just put those together, and so that they flowed as one thing. And so then I cut together and then used as a monologue and cut and clipped some things and made that one thing. So grouping is okay. And the other thing I want to talk about, sort of the fourth thing, is sort of a decision of how much verbal flavor to put into a monologue. And what I mean by that is this. You may have somebody who stutters or somebody who says a lot. And that is as valid as anything that they say is the stuff that happens in between what they say, sort of what is the verbal sound of how they speak? What is the rhythm? But you want it to also be accessible to an audience or to an actor or to a director. And so sometimes you have this decision, and it sounds really stupid, but you have this decision of how many ums do I leave in there? How many do I clip out? How many stutters do I put in there? How much do you put in? And it's okay if, for the sake of clarity, you want to cut back on some of that, sort of give the flavor of it. This is something that this person does. But if they're doing it every other line and you can't understand it, it's okay to clip some of that for clarity. So some things you might want to cut for clarity, and that's okay. That's okay. I would say that that's okay, and that doesn't, reframe the person's position, because that's the one thing you don't want to do. And so number 5 would be careful about reframing. You don't want to cut something to a point where it creates a different meaning than intended by the subject. That could definitely be bad. That, in fact, is awful. You never want to do that. Like somebody, you're interviewing somebody, and you says, you're a very controversial speaker. People have said that you hate, that you that you dislike white people or something, and then they give you some very layered, nuanced response. You don't want to cut it so that the response is no longer nuanced and gives you a meaning that wasn't intended. And sometimes newspaper articles do that. Sometimes when people say I'm taken out of context, they really are being taken out of context. You know what I mean? So you'll be like, yeah, I hear you don't like white people. So the person gives you a response like this. Well, I don't like white people. I don't like black people. I don't like Asian people. I don't like anybody as a group. Now, I like some white people. I dislike others. I like some black people. I dislike others. I like some Asian people. I dislike others, but I don't like anybody or dislike anybody as a group, right? And so that's the statement they give you. And then when you run it, you run, I don't like white people, period. Yeah, it's what they said, but you've clipped out the rest that gives you the meaning to what they were trying to say. They were trying to give you a nuanced answer. And then as the interviewer, you punish them by taking them out of context and getting them in trouble. You never want to set up your subject. So you want to make sure that you keep everything in context and you don't reframe. Or sometimes what will happen is you'll try to reframe something for a good reason. And that has happened a lot historically, where a well-meaning person will take somebody's narrative and then they'll clip it up to make it more accessible to a group in order to promote the cause, whatever it is. But it isn't at all what the person said, or it had none of the flavor of the person. One of the greatest examples of that is a piece that most people know called Ain't I a Woman? And it's a piece that is, pretty awfully butchered. It doesn't capture the way Sojourner Truth, who was sort of the author of the piece, so-called, how she spoke. It turns out that Sojourner Truth spoke with a fairly thick Dutch accent because the people, her slave owners before her, were Dutch, and so she had kind of a Dutch accent. But whenever you see that monologue done, it's always by a black woman, sort of a storyteller, and she has some Southern accent. Oh, man, she's doing like the Southern accent, when in fact the person didn't have a Southern accent. And a lot of the words in Ain't I a Woman are really not what Sojourner Truth said. In fact, she probably never said Ain't I a Woman. That's sort of a refrain that was put in to give it sort of symmetry. And the reason that it was done was for very good reason. I forget the lady's name, but it was a white lady who kind of reshaped that. And she was doing it because she was trying to promote abolition. And she was trying to make that accessible to white communities to push the cause of abolition, which is a very good reason to do that. Her heart was in the right place. The problem is that when you do that, it creates erasure of the person. And what happens is years later, the true Sojourner Truth has almost totally, utterly, and completely been erased. What has been put in her place is the stereotypical Southern black lady with her socks rolled down, and that's not who Sojourner Truth was. It's not how she talked, and that's unfortunate. And as a playwright or a writer or a script writer or a screenwriter, you don't want to create the erasure of a person, even if you're trying to do it for good reasons. If you don't want to try to make them sound better and more cogent to the point where you've erased who that person really is. And it is such an easy temptation. I've faced it myself on many days where you're trying to create this person that doesn't exist. And by doing that, you erase who they are. So you want to be careful about erasure when you're doing sort of these evidence-based plays. Lastly, what I want to leave you with is telling somebody's story is a worthy endeavor. Doing these kind of plays is a worthy endeavor, but they're also plays and scripts in which you have to sort of view yourself as a tightrope walker. And you're always sort of walking on this tightrope and trying not to fall off. But you have to be really careful. You have to be really purposeful, and you have to really understand what it is that you're letting loose in the world, because so often this happens. As we as writers don't understand our power. We see ourselves as just writing some crappy little play, but you never know. You never know if you are really writing the first page of somebody's history, because oftentimes what gets written down, what gets performed, is what lives in people's minds as the truth. And you don't want to be responsible for forwarding a fiction about somebody and totally erasing who that person is. I think that is sort of an awful side effect of this kind of writing when you're telling somebody's story or interpreting somebody's truth. Sojourner Truth is that example. The real Sojourner Truth doesn't exist anymore because of one person making sort of editorial decisions that sort of now stand in the place of reality. We don't want to do that. So always be thinking about that when you're putting this out into the world, that oftentimes that this truth that you're writing will live as that person's truth. So you want to have that in your mind. I want to thank everybody for coming to my lecture. I appreciate you. If you have any questions about anything that I've said or anything that is not clear about what I said, please, you can email me at mikeoatman@hotmail.com, MikeOatman@hotmail.com, and you can ask me anything you want to ask me, and I'll respond. Just put sort of in the tagline, lecture questions, and I'll respond as quick as humanly possible if I can to answer any question or give any guidance, or if there's a project that you're working on of this kind and you want sort of some tips or some different insights on what to do or what not to do, hit me up anytime. I am happy to respond. So again, thank you and have a great residency.